In episode 1, we suggested that God showed up as the key to recovery, largely due to circumstance. AA co-founder Bill Wilson's upbringing, how he was introduced to recovery, and the person who introduced it to him all helped him see recovery as dependent on God. The meeting with his old friend Ebby Thatcher, who had gotten sober in a Christian fellowship called the Oxford Group, and who Bill had known for most of his life, led Wilson to question some deeply held convictions, which in turn opened the door to his own recovery. But swap out any of those three ingredients, Wilson's upbringing, his introduction to recovery, and who told him about it, and Alcoholics Anonymous and other spin-off 12-step programs would probably look very different. The God idea was born of circumstance, not necessity. Since AA's founding in 1935, there's been a lot of progress in drug and alcohol recovery. In addition to 12-step approaches, here are a few other typical ones. Cognitive behavioral therapy, also known as CBT. Contingency management interventions. Community reinforcement approach. Motivational enhancement therapy. The Matrix model. Smart recovery. Buddhism, typically Dharma recovery, and family behavior therapy. What all of these approaches have in common with 12-step programs is reframing perception. Think of reframing as looking at a building from one location and then moving to another location to look at the same building. It's the same building, but it looks different. Our perspective has changed. Our perspective has been reframed. Wilson says as much in the Big Book. He writes, the alcoholic, quote, finally realizes that he has gone through a profound alteration in his reaction to life, unquote. In other words, the alcoholic has undergone a profound reframing or shift in perspective, and that shift is brought about by the practice of the 12 steps, specifically steps 3, 10, 11, and 12. It's useful to take a moment to break out the steps to see how they fit together as a process, to see them as a series of actions that culminate in recovery. In AA, steps 1 and 2 are conclusions. Either we're unable to stop drinking once we start, or we're not. Either we believe there's a solution to this mess, or we don't. The word powerless in step 1 gets a lot of flack from agnostics and atheists because they think it implies the need for a super being or a higher power. But AA is simply making the point that due to our dependence on the substance, stopping is going to be difficult because of our physical need to drink or use more, what AA calls a craving for more to drink. That assistance, at first, is usually as simple as detoxification. Stopping with a little assistance is doable. Staying stopped remains the hard part. Step 2 suggests that a super being or higher power will restore us to what it calls sanity. But the only reference to what Bill Wilson meant by sanity, or its opposite, insanity, is where he says insanity is a, quote, lack of proportion, or the inability, quote, to think straight, unquote, which is another way of saying faulty perspective, or another way of saying we need a, quote, profound alteration in our reaction to life. Which brings us to step 3. And like we suggested in episode 2, it's here that a lot of people balk. The question, what does God have to do with my drinking problem, is a question that's been asked by many, many people over many, many years when they first came to the rooms. It's a good question, and one that deserves a little background on what addiction research has uncovered since AA's start in 1935. Back in the day, addiction was seen as a moral failure, and AA played a big part in getting people to begin to see that differently. Many addiction researchers now view addiction as an outgrowth of pain, abuse, neglect, and generational trauma. We also know that someone's chances of becoming addicted are affected by genetic predisposition and environmental conditions. The coping skills that dysfunctional environments force people to adopt are immediately forgotten once the substance is found. The substance becomes the coping mechanism until it, too, stops working. Once we put the substance down, we're left with the original pain that required the coping skills in the first place. but they don't work out too well. In fact, they cause further problems. That's the focus of recovery, reframing, a new perspective, a change in one's reaction to life, a new way to deal with pain, and that begins in step 3. If you've come up through 12-step rooms where the word God and the phrase higher power are bandied about and people talk about God fixing you, removing your obsession, and restoring your sanity, then what's actually required to recover may come as a surprise. The problem with relying on God to do all these things is that there are actions you need to take to set the process in motion and keep it running. If you've struggled to recover or are practicing an over-reliance on outside forces, whether that's God or other people, you may be wondering whether God's playing favorites, or maybe you're just not ready, or worst of all, maybe your recovery just isn't God's plan. The mental gymnastics people need to go through to make sense of God in all of this is truly breathtaking. Despite the program stating clearly that action on our part is required, the God idea misleads many people into believing that they are the recipient of a gift that requires no effort on their part. That's just not true. Let's return to the idea that defines addiction research today, that pain is the root of the problem. AA says alcohol is but a symptom, right? But what does that mean? A flickering light isn't about the light bulb. It's about the wiring or electrical service affecting the light bulb's behavior. Alcohol and drugs are the flickering lights. Alcohol and drugs are just symptoms of underlying problems. AA calls it a spiritual malady. Buddhism labels it attachment. Smart Recovery says it's a disconnection between how we see a situation versus what is actually happening. And CBT says people's negative thoughts and behaviors are the problem. AA uses religious language. Smart Recovery uses terms from rational emotive behavioral therapy, and CBT replaces spiritual malady with negative thoughts. But each approach is saying the same thing. The way we approach life is the cause of much of our pain. Whatever you call it, it needs to be addressed. If it's not about God, then what are we to do? Let's remind ourselves of the direction for step 3 first, and then break it down. Quote, first of all, we had to quit playing God. It didn't work. Next, we decided that hereafter in this drama of life, God was going to be our director. End quote. The religious overtones are deep here, but keep in mind that this is how Wilson understood what had happened to him, and he is sincerely trying to help us duplicate his success. We can quibble about his language, or instead look for the ideas that underpin the terms he used. Remember that in the previous chapter he advises us not to automatically take his understanding of the idea of God as our own, but rather to ask ourselves what these terms mean to us. He tells us that in order to move forward with step 3, we need to be convinced that any life run on self-will can hardly be successful. He defines self-will in a very specific way and uses an example of an actor walking into a theater where everyone present has a job to do, has a role to play. But instead of playing his own role, the actor plays the role of the director. He does so because he believes he knows how the show should be produced, how the actors should act, and how the show should end. Pretty sure of himself, our actor. Wonder how everyone else, though, feels about his behavior. Could his efforts to run the show be the source of the pain? Here's the first part of the step again. First of all, we had to quit playing God. It didn't work. This first use of the word God here is referring to the all-knowing, all-powerful super-being that so many people struggle to embrace. But put aside whether God is real or not and focus instead on its attributes, all-knowing and all-powerful. Now reread the direction, but this time with the attributes in mind. It tells us to quit acting like we know everything, see everything, and are able to control outcomes. We aren't, and we can't. We have a role to play and are responsible for doing so, but that doesn't include telling everyone else how to play their roles. Here's the second part of the step again. Next, we decided that hereafter in this drama of life, God was going to be our director. Oh, and it's worth mentioning here that in this second part of the step, we're advised to do this in the presence of someone else. We're advised to have a witness to our decision. We're advised to establish accountability for our commitment to the new path. In the first part of the step, we agreed that trying to run the show was the cause of our pain, and we agreed to stop doing that, or at least work on not doing that. In the second part of the step, we're asked to decide that from this point forward, we're going to turn our will and lives over to something. Doesn't exactly score up with the idea of free will and a program of action, but let's see how we can use this idea to push us across the finish line. How about this? Next, we decided to commit ourselves to our new approach to life and trust that the outcome will be successful. We'll look at the remaining steps, minus God, in a future episode.